Look at a map, any map. You will see lines, clean, confident, often straight lines cutting across mountains, rivers, deserts, and plains. Lines dividing the world into neat colored shapes, each with a name, a flag, a government, and millions of people who believe in it completely. Now here is the thing that should stop you cold. Those lines are not real. Not in any physical sense. You cannot see them from space. Animals do not recognize them. Rivers do not stop at them. The wind does not care. Every single border on every single map on Earth is a human invention, a story that enough people agreed to believe that it became, for all practical purposes, true. So how did that happen? How did a species that spent 2 million years wandering freely across every continent on Earth end up dividing that same Earth into nearly 200 locked boxes, each with its own rules, its own identity, and its own willingness to go to war over an invisible line? The answer begins not with politics or kings or armies. It begins with grass. For most of human prehistory, your ancestors were nomads. They followed game, tracked seasons, and moved with the rhythms of the natural world. There were no borders because there was no reason for them. Territory existed, loosely. Groups had ranges. Bands of hunter-gatherers occupied areas they knew well, and they defended those areas when threatened. But these were not countries. They were habits, overlapping, fluid, and entirely dependent on who was strong enough to maintain them. Everything changed roughly 10,000 years ago, in a region of the Middle East known as the Fertile Crescent. This is where humans first discovered, or perhaps stumbled into, agriculture. The cultivation of wild grasses into reliable grain crops, wheat, barley, emmer. For the first time in the history of the species, food did not need to be followed. It could be grown, and if it could be grown, it needed to be protected. Archaeologist James Scott at Yale University argues that this shift was perhaps the most consequential and underappreciated transformation in human history. Once you plant a crop, you are committed to a place. You cannot follow the herd when your wheat is 3 weeks from harvest. You cannot abandon your grain stores to seasonal migration. Agriculture nailed humans to the ground, and the ground for the first time became something worth owning. This is where the first territorial logic appears. Not countries yet, not even close, but the seed of the idea. This field is ours. This water source belongs to our group. Cross this boundary and there will be consequences. As settlements grew, the problem of management emerged. A band of 30 hunter-gatherers can organize itself through relationships and reputation alone. But a village of 300 people, then a town of 3,000, then a city of 30,000 cannot. Somebody needs to manage the grain stores, settle disputes, organize labor, and defend the walls. Enter the first states. The earliest proto-governments appear in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, around 6,000 years ago. Historian Yuval Noah Harari has documented how these early administrative structures were fundamentally about control of agricultural surplus. Whoever controlled the grain controlled the people. Tax collection, record keeping, and military organization all emerged together as a single interlocking system, and that system needed edges. It needed a defined territory where its rules applied and beyond which they did not. These early states were city-states, small by modern standards, a city and the farmland surrounding it, but the logic was fully formed. Inside this boundary, we have laws and kings and taxes. Outside it, you are on your own. This is the first time in human history that a line on the ground meant something political. For thousands of years, these lines were drawn and redrawn constantly. Empires rose, empires fell. The Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire. Each one drew the largest map it could manage, then watched it shrink back. The borders of ancient empires were not the crisp lines of modern maps. They were gradients, zones of control that faded from the center outward, becoming suggestions at the edges. The Roman frontier was not a wall in most places. It was a transition zone where Roman influence blurred into something else. The concept of the nation, the idea that a country should correspond to a people with a shared language, culture, and identity, is surprisingly recent. Political scientist Benedict Anderson called nations imagined communities, not imaginary in the sense of fictional, but imagined in the sense that their members will never meet most of their fellow members, yet each carries in their mind an image of their communion. This idea crystallized in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 is often cited as the birth of the modern state system. After decades of devastating religious war, European powers agreed that each sovereign territory had the right to govern itself without outside interference. This was a radical idea. For the first time, the map of Europe began to stabilize around the concept of permanent, recognized borders between sovereign states. But here is where the story gets complicated and uncomfortable. Most of the world's current borders were not drawn by the people who live within them. They were drawn by European colonial powers, often with a ruler and no particular interest in the ethnic, linguistic, or cultural realities on the ground. The Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 is the most notorious example. European powers sat down in Germany and divided the entire African continent between themselves without a single African leader present. They drew straight lines across a continent of thousands of distinct peoples, languages, and kingdoms and called it order. These lines became the borders of modern African nations, and they have caused conflict, civil war, and humanitarian crisis ever since. The same story played out across the Middle East East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, lines drawn by distant powers for administrative convenience, bequeathed to newly independent nations as the framework for their existence. This is why so many modern countries feel, from the inside, like they are held together with argument and will rather than natural cohesion, because in many cases, they are. The country is the story, and the story was written by someone else. So what actually holds a country together? The answer, when you strip away the armies and the laws and the bureaucracies, is belief, shared belief. Economist Daron Acemoglu at MIT has argued that nations are fundamentally coordination mechanisms. A country works when enough people inside it believe it works, when they agree to use the same currency, recognize the same courts, pay the same taxes, and identify with the same flag. The moment that belief fractures, the country begins to fracture with it. This is why flags matter more than they should, why national anthems produce real emotion, why sports tournaments become proxy wars of identity. Your brain is running ancient social software that was designed to bind small groups together through shared story and symbol. Nations are the largest scale hack of that software in human history, a way of tricking a brain evolved for a band of 50 into feeling kinship with 50 million strangers. It works, imperfectly, often violently, but it works, and it is worth remembering the next time you see a map, the next time you cross a border or wave a flag or feel that pull of national identity, that none of this was inevitable. For 2 million years, your ancestors lived without any of it. The lines came late, they came fast, and they came from human minds, which means they can be redrawn by human minds. Countries are the most powerful fiction our species has ever agreed to believe in, and like all the best fictions, they have become, in the believing, entirely real. Look at a map, any map, you will see lines. Now you know exactly where they came from, and you will never look at them quite the same way again.